Hi, everybody. Welcome to the OpenStack and Beyond podcast. This is August 17th, and today we're going to be talking about whether OpenStack is enterprise ready. I am Sharon Zitzman. I'm filling in for Shlomo Swedler, and I'm joined by my humble and awesome co-host, Nati Shalom. Hey, Nati.
Hey, Sharon. Glad to see you.
Yeah, it's great to be on the show. Shlomo will be joining us next time. So it's been an interesting week in the OpenStack sphere. A lot around containers and Docker, as always. Magnum is all the news. It's really interesting that this is like, a really hot topic. Mirantis are joining forces with CoreOS. Everybody's wondering whether OpenStack's Magnum, Kubernetes, or Mesos will control the cluster sphere. All while, Tech Republic are putting out pieces on whether OpenStack is overkill for Docker. So it's interesting. What do you think about this whole space and area? What's your take on it?
Yeah. So basically, I think that the containers and OpenStack is definitely in a course of, if it doesn't get together one way or the other, then it's obviously going to collide. And some would say that container is going to win everything, and some would say no. If you look at that from a technical perspective, containers fill in a certain gap in the stack, and you still need multi-tenancy, you still need storage, you still need a lot of things that you would expect to get from OpenStack. So technically, I think that the synergy is a strong argument. The question is how well the two communities will cooperate. And if I look at the announcement with Google and Kubernetes and the OpenStack Foundation, I think that's the most promising announcement that shows that the directions is actually, I'm very optimistic that now things will get in the right direction with regard to containers and OpenStack.
What are your thoughts on Magnum?
So Magnum is an interesting offering. I think it's a low-hanging fruit to get containers on OpenStack, but obviously that's a fairly early, initiative on how to do that. I think that if you really want to get native containers on OpenStack, you really need to think beyond Nova and reduce the reliance on Nova for that respect, and have more native, if you like, containers on OpenStack that doesn't necessarily rely on Nova. And that's more radical thoughts. That's my personal thoughts, and I think that's the direction that I would see makes more sense than just putting a wrapper around Kubernetes and other orchestration tools in that regard.
I think this is as good a time as any to introduce our panelists, who I'd want to hear their take on it as well. We have Lauren Nelson of Forrester joining us, and Kris Koehntopp from Booking.com, Senior Scalability Engineer. Lauren, what's your thought on everything going on around the whole container sphere and OpenStack? And
Sure. So containers are here to stay. That's the general stance here at Forrester, is that essentially it problem solves for a lot of the issues we've had in the cloud realm around portability and interoperability. It also addresses how do we potentially bring down data center costs by eliminating hypervisor licensing costs or providing additional consolidation capabilities through container technology. So certainly something that we've seen a substantial amount of interest in terms of how it will relate to OpenStack. I think what's clear is that the OpenStack community is, for the most part, looking at how do we make Docker a parallel service? How do we make sure that we aren't rewriting when there's an existing standard that exists elsewhere? And so that, there are certain efforts like Magnum and other solutions that try and hasten that roadmap, but I wouldn't say per se that that's necessarily set in stone yet.
Interesting. I'm just going to also introduce Lauren. You're welcome to introduce yourself. Lauren recently wrote the very interesting paper, OpenStack is Ready, Are You? On the production readiness of OpenStack, and that's kind of the topic at hand today. Lauren, how would you introduce yourself? We'd be happy to hear about what you find is your expertise, and go ahead.
Sure. So I'm a senior analyst at Forrester. I'm on our infrastructure and operations team, and I focus on cloud all day, every day. And some of my areas of expertise are hosted private cloud and internal private cloud. And I've been following OpenStack since San Francisco. So it's been a while. I think this will be my 7th summit upcoming. And I wrote a number of reports on it, and the latest of which is OpenStack is ready, are you? Calling out kind of less of the sensationalized hype of OpenStack and some of its issues, but more of a realistic piece around what it's being used today for enterprises, what is not being used for, some of the pain points that you should be aware of as you get started with OpenStack, but that shouldn't be a barrier to entry. And then finally, how do you build your team? How do you make sure you have the right folks to make sure that you're able to move forward with this?
Interesting. Kris, we'd love to hear your take on the whole Docker sphere, and also for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, I have been working for Booking until last year in April, and then I started with a hosting company in Germany called SysEleven. We are an e-commerce hoster that is currently running a lot of large German web shops with hard performance SLAs, and that happens on a non-OpenStack platform, and that doesn't have an API. We are currently building the OpenStack platform, which will have an API, and it will also have the hard performance SLAs that we have with the other platform. So that will be rather interesting. The last year has been a journey, technology-wise, Havana, Icehouse, Juno, now Kilo. Also a lot of SDN, Juniper Contrail and Midokura, and a lot of storage, filers, Ceph, and now Cobite. So I think I have seen something in that area, despite the fact that I'm only doing this for a year now. And yeah, also we have learned a few very interesting things about how an existing data center network infrastructure is probably not capable of carrying an OpenStack workload, but that is maybe something for later. Containers. Well, we are running containers now, but that's OpenVZ, not Docker. Docker is an awesome tool. It's an awesome development tool. That is a really, really convenient way to produce deliverables, but Docker containers are not a deliverable. You probably don't want them in production right now. There's a lot of work to be done for them to be useful in a production setup.
And do you have any, take on the OpenStack-related Docker integration projects, the Kubernetes integration projects of Mirantis and CoreOS? And
Docker and Kubernetes are really interesting products. Kubernetes is in some ways a better cluster than OpenStack is, but it totally doesn't have any multi-tenancy isolation story, which you need at least in the hosting environment. It does not have an SDN and an SDS story, so it is not really an alternative. OpenStack does not have proper cluster integration. There's a lot of problems knowing what is online and what is offline. And it also doesn't have a concept of what Docker calls its graph engine. And that makes glance images and Docker images very incompatible. That's a major project to resolve that. If you do that, if you address these two topics, then probably OpenStack can integrate Docker-like workloads very nicely.
Okay, that's an interesting take. Nati, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think if we kind of connect that to my comment previously to that, I think that native integration with OpenStack does make sense. It would require more than a wrapper around Kubernetes, and that's I think fairly consistent with what Kris mentioned. So I think, generally speaking, I think the good news is that there is an awareness in that, and you could see a lot of push actually in OpenStack, Silicon Valley. A lot of the topics would be around Docker integration into OpenStack. So I think there is already large players that are focusing on that and realizing that the two has to be married together, or the separation will basically be a bad news for OpenStack.
Right now you have Nova Docker or whatever it's called. So you can execute Docker images, but that alone is useless. You also need an understanding of the way Docker layers images in the OpenStack image service for that to make any sense at all. So
yeah, that's
now it's a technology proof of concept, but it's not really anything that you can even let near production in any way.
That's why I thought that think beyond Nova with regard to native integration with containers, not just think of Docker as a layer on top of Nova or how Nova manage it. So that's kind of the reason for my previous comment is really related from that experience that you just mentioned and the limitation that you mentioned. So I think that, Sharon, if we kind of go with that, and I think that Loren put a very nice report that, as Loren mentioned, covers kind of the state of the union of OpenStack. I think it covers both the pitfall in OpenStack, but also the current state, and it gives a very good overview for those who wants to see where the industry is. And I've listed a list of questions out of this report that I believe would be relevant for the context of this discussion, Loren. So I'm not sure if you have access to those questions, but I can go through them. The first question is, I think that everyone is talking about the maturity of OpenStack, but in essence, OpenStack itself is built out of many services. Some of them are new, some of them are fairly old. So the question is, how do you measure maturity of a project like OpenStack, which have so many pieces in different level of maturity?
Sure. So first of all, the foundation, OpenStack Foundation, has their own way of measuring maturity, and they do a number of tests to essentially establish maturity from a technology perspective, and then they also look at the maturity of each project from an adoption perspective. So they're assuming that if a certain number of enterprises or end users have adopted that particular project, it has reached a certain level of maturity, and that's actually how at the recent summit they had decided what is in core code versus what is a project outside of that core set of projects. And so that was very well documented at the last summit. In my own opinion, kind of when you look at the market and the OpenStack services that are available, what you'll find in the core set of services is, yes, many of them are the first services that became available. Many of them are the core services that are required in order to actually launch a basic cloud service. So one of the things that's a personal pet peeve of mine is you look at the cloud market and you see the term CMP, Cloud Management Platform, being used to describe many different solutions and capabilities. When more accurately, you've got cloud management capabilities and you've got cloud building capabilities. And OpenStack and its core and most mature features are very much around cloud building capabilities, about what it takes to actually build a basic cloud environment and then have very lightweight management capabilities around it in order to essentially enable and provide some sort of management across that and monitoring across that environment. And so you'll see some of the very basic capabilities are those that you found in very early iterations of any cloud platform, either private or public. So you'll see compute, you'll see basic dashboard, you'll see network storage, you'll see all these different elements that are very commonly considered within the core solution that's very centric to our cloud platform perspective. Whereas a number of the other more recent services focus on fringe capabilities, focus on making the difference between a platform and a full cloud management suite, where they're providing that next level of cloud management capabilities. So that's another way when I look at the different projects that are available and various different levels of maturity. Part of it's how long it's been in market. Part of it is number of adopters. But I think the other kind of unsaid element is the first very core features that were developed were those very centric around cloud building in general, whereas these more fringe ones are about integrations into other services, building out functionality that's asked about or a hot topic rather than needed for basic cloud provisioning capabilities, or that take it to that next level and try and establish OpenStack as just not just where you build your cloud, but also at the level you manage it or at the level where your developers can interact with it.
And do you think on that regard that, you know, the fact that some of the services that are even well adopted, the storage network, are still, if I look at the pitfall that you mentioned, are still facing some of the basic limitations, like if you reach beyond 60 instances, you start to feel it, and so forth. Do you think that the fact that it's spanned to different projects happened too soon, and that's something that could have been done differently?
Well, it's tough because early on in an open source initiative, first of all, you're trying to gain momentum. Then you're trying to encourage the vendor and community to grow. And with that, they need areas to establish their differentiation. And part of that was done through different projects. So as an open source organization moves forward and tries to mature, it's a delicate balance of trying to keep the audience there, both from a vendor and end user perspective, while trying to harden it, while trying to make it more mature and fix bugs. And so that's been kind of the interesting of the last few years is trying to make that pivot and focus more on maturing as a solution and less towards sensationalism and less towards these shiny new features and solutions. And I think it was back in the Atlanta summit, it might have been the summit previous to that, where they had made efforts to try and define a core and to try and discourage it from building out and getting tons of capabilities, but with less maturity, and grow past what it should. And that was actually when it brought back into that kind of concept of how do we not reinvent the wheel? How do we essentially establish a base and then leverage other solutions that have already established momentum to take on those capabilities? So instead of building our own container solution, how do we build integration points into OpenStack projects that are existing? Instead of building our own platform as a service, how do we tie into existing platform as a service capabilities in the market? So I think OpenStack has done a good job at trying to establish a core with certain level of maturity around it and limit how quickly the additional projects grow out. And they're still trying to deal and refine that model of still giving access, still giving ability to innovate, but without at the expense of the maturity of the other projects.
Interesting. Kris, I know that you have a lot of thoughts about that based on your recent experience with OpenStack. Why don't you share that with us?
I would judge maturity from the point of view of a user story. Or in this high-level case, it's more an epic than a story. And I'm actually, if you look at the OpenStack community, that is not very much in the forefront of everything. You see a lot of projects that develop more or less independently, but you see very little integration or at least no obvious communication between the various sub-projects. And that is actually, from a community management point of view, one of the very big drawbacks of the OpenStack project. If you define a simple user epic like departmental enterprise computing, you would say something like, I'm a department in a large enterprise organization and want to be able to deploy virtualized workloads on a rack full of state-of-the-art hardware backed by filers or something. And then OpenStack would have an answer to that problem or a story to tell how they solve that. And in this particular case, that would probably even be a functional or valid answer, even with the traditional data center networking, and with integration of all of that. But if you tell a different story and say, like, I'm a hoster and I'm accepting managed and unmanaged workloads, which I don't actually know because they come from the outside from multiple tenants, and I want to provide infrastructure as a service with and without consulting on top and with hard service level agreements and hard quotas and things. And I need some kind of billing and multi-tenancy and storage also, not just backed by filers, but also by a distributed filing system. Then the story that OpenStack is telling is a lot less mature. If you grow beyond the rack, it is also a lot of problems that you're running into at just the hardware level. And all of this and the operational aspects of that also need to be addressed a lot more. That is not just a software problem. It's not just development problems here. It is also operational, educational problems, best practices in building a data center for OpenStack, because your default networking, your default data center is probably not capable of running a fully distributed Ceph or Kubernetes or even HDFS workload without melting all switches. So all of this needs to be taken into account and also be integrated in the entire OpenStack story here.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, this is Lauren. I was just going to add that some of the recent efforts that they've made is trying to take a step towards achieving this, where essentially, how do we automate the process to build integration between the efforts that are made on for each project refresh? So as we publish new capabilities in each project, how do we make sure they're compatible? And it's certainly been a pain point in the past, but some of the efforts the community is making now and kind of some of the efforts towards API integration into other projects has certainly been something that they're addressing and starting to work towards. So it's certainly on their horizon.
It's most definitely not there yet.
Yeah. So if I would summarize the two perspectives here, is that I think that it's for if you're looking at that for departmental use, then the capabilities of OpenStack can get you there. If you're looking for as a hoster, building a public cloud around it, the gaps are still far, which means that you either need to do what HE tried to do and other that I've seen complement it yourself, assuming that it will get into OpenStack somewhere down the road, or you would expect that it will be harder. I think that's also correlates, and that's leading me to the next question, Lauren, to the demographic of users of OpenStack. So I think what we're actually seeing, and I think that's alluded nicely in your report, that most of the users of OpenStack are actually large enterprises that put a lot of engineering work around that and less of startups and small companies around that. How much is that indicative of the maturity of the project, and also what does it tell about OpenStack?
Well, what the report actually said was not saying that it wasn't adopted among startups. The big thing that was called out is that it is enterprises too. And that's been a question for a while of who is adopting OpenStack. And there have certainly been unicorn examples of enterprises that have made early bets in that realm. But if you look, it's growing. And there's a substantial number of Fortune 10, Fortune 50, Fortune 100, Fortune 500s that have adopted OpenStack, which shows that enterprises really are adopting OpenStack. It hasn't reached a point where it's the majority of adopters, but it certainly is a portion of them. And what does that mean? So in my mind, it means that the enterprise is now considering an open source tool to essentially be its cloud building capability, which is a huge step forward and a substantial step for open source technology in general. The nuance that I kind of shared in this report is it's not being used as the predominant private cloud platform within the organization. It's being used for systems of engagement, for net new workloads, to be the primary solution for those resources within the organization. It is not being used atop traditional back-end systems as their default private cloud that is taking their virtualization environment to the next step. Oftentimes organizations have a separate private cloud that's targeted at that approach. And more often than not, open source has been brought in after that tool has been enabled, where there has been challenges around meeting time deadlines, where an organization hasn't enabled self-service access or automation, and this has been brought in retroactively to truly enable self-service access and a much more developer-centric story around net new than a lot of the other private cloud initiatives that have been happening for the last 3 to 5 years.
And so just back to that comment, that a lot of the enterprises are using it for new net workload. And at the same time, I see on different surveys, including, I think you mentioned that in your report, that when you ask the reasons why they've gone with OpenStack, then they basically say that they look for OpenStack to be the common ground for all cloud activities in the industry. It's also in the one of the graphs that you showed in the report. It shows that 82% of the workload are actually interacting. That OpenStack is interacting with other clouds. So how do you put the two together?
Yeah, so first of all, if listeners are not aware, the OpenStack surveys, the user survey that's put out into the field is incredibly useful in terms of getting a current state assessment about how OpenStack is being used today. And one of the stats that comes out of that survey is that, for the most part, OpenStacks are not islands. They're not acting upon themselves. They're not a solo entity that isn't interacting with other public cloud environments. What was interesting from the survey is that they showed statistics for OpenStack environments connected to other public cloud OpenStack environments, and then OpenStack environments connected to just other public clouds in general, and found that a lot of organizations are connecting OpenStack to AWS, connecting OpenStack to public clouds that are not based on OpenStack APIs, which is not what you would anticipate. What you would anticipate for enterprises that pitched that their value add to going to OpenStack was interoperability and portability of workloads without vendor lock-in, was this ability of using those same templates and using them for a public cloud environment. And that level of interoperability, portability is not achievable today. Certainly working in that direction with Heat using the Oasis Tosca template consistency. But there's also a lack of major public cloud players that are OpenStack based today. There are certainly a couple, but it really isn't to the same extent as some of the other predominant public cloud offerings. And so this stat to me shows that OpenStack has moved past test dev. Enterprise use cases are using it for real-time systems of engagement production level environments, and these production level environments are not standalone independent applications. They are dependent on other application types, and these application types are sometimes located in public cloud environments outside the enterprise's firewall.
I see. So Kris, I think we touched viewpoints here that are related to other aspects, if you like, of maturity. First of all, it's the type of organization that are using it, and we'll soon talk about the skill set that you need to actually run something like that. And Ron also mentioned, I think, the other interesting part, which OpenStack is not an island. Does that correlate with what you're seeing in the market?
In a way, I totally agree, for example, with the assessment in that report. It lists 2 or 3 system architects and 3 to 5 operators with Linux and open source experience, an infrastructure system and call, modern developers with infrastructure configuration competencies and C-level buy-in and everything. So that is what I think what you would need for an OpenStack deployment in an enterprise. But that is also the hallmark of a development team and not really a deployment of a product in any way. So what you see here is a staffing for something that comes as a box of parts that more or less fit, but that need substantial customizing and evaluation and technical fiddling to actually make it work. It's not something that you unbox and deploy and then integrate into your enterprise using standard interfaces in any way. It is pretty much a custom job. And I agree that currently is the state of affairs with OpenStack in the enterprise or any other environment, actually.
And I think that's... sorry, go ahead, Kris.
And of course, if you look at the typical enterprise that has data everywhere, and data from anywhere flows everywhere else, that is just how it is. So obviously it is not an island. It needs to come from traditional virtualization, from traditional hard iron into OpenStack, and it needs to go back, and it will probably also flow between the clouds, because you probably have a campaign running somewhere, and so you have data in Google Analytics. And then you have sales data that needs to correlate with your campaign that is probably in your OpenStack or somewhere else. And in order to calculate conversion, you need to make this meet, for example. That is something that I have seen as a requirement, and that would totally fit the pattern that Lauren describes here. So that makes a lot of sense as well. Not in the way of interoperability of workloads. I want to be able to migrate my stuff from Amazon to Google Compute to my own OpenStack, but in the way of data migration, data flows for correlation or for data warehousing or analytics or stuff like that.
So how do people solve it today, Kris?
The solutions I have seen are firstly dealing with the problem of moving the data, and then dealing with processing with the local copy. And you either use products for that or you script it yourself, if you can do that, if you know how to read and write code.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in terms of workload, I know that there's been the Tosca translator projects and other things, and I know that even Heat had some level of abstraction that was trying to be compatible with Amazon. There's been also a big debate whether OpenStack should have adopted the EC2 API. Where does that land in your view in terms of importance of interoperability? Which approach do you think OpenStack should adopt to increase interoperability?
The problem that OpenStack has at the moment is to get reliably the job done. And the API is totally second. I mean, you have, again, from the paper, and I share that experience as well, stuff stated like if you start 50 instances at once, your cluster is probably not going to survive. And we have been reproducing that with other people's OpenStack deployments because we have been observing that effect in our own test deployment, and we thought we were stupid. But when we ran the same test script that brought down our cluster on other deployments that were run by people who were charging money for their OpenStack, they also came down. So there are things in OpenStack that are probably very basic and that still don't work, even in current OpenStack. And when that is solved, then we can talk about flavors of APIs or if Amazon compatibility is holding you back or stuff like that. But really, the flaws in OpenStack that we observe at the moment, they are, in part at least, very extremely basic. And that needs a lot more addressing to turn it into a product. And to something that you could put the fate of your company and your employees on in order to turn it into something that you can trust and that can meet a hard SLA.
So that means that, if I kind of summarize that, it means that interoperability is kind of currently a luxury to deal with right now. There's a more fundamental aspect to deal with before we get into that. And back to you, Lauren, on the comment that you mentioned, and I'm trying to kind of think as you speak on some of the comments that you mentioned about how organization adopting it, and if I go down to also the organizational structure, definitely the kind of organization that I know and many of the organizations would have hard time today after they build all the practices around whatever infrastructure that they have today to build that type of practices successfully. I've seen a lot of enterprises trying to do that, but they failed from different reasons because they didn't really follow that line of thought that I think you articulated very well in the report. How much do you see enterprises have the appetite to re-engineer themselves towards that model?
There are two aspects, I think, here. One is that the infrastructure as code thing, and the developers provision stuff themselves by writing a Heat script or something. And by just writing a bit of script, you get basically network hardware, network connections, machine storage. That is something that actually is a big degree of freedom, and that is the major selling point of OpenStack. I think the key win really is Heat. If you get that to work, then basically you set your developers free. You still need to talk to them about certain patterns that are requirements from the operations side, and best practices that they need to take into account by whatever kind of service they design. But that is the truly great thing about OpenStack, that it achieves, when it works on good days, this degree of freedom and that speed of deployment and that developer freedom.
I see. And Lauren, what's your take on that?
So there's a number of different elements. So first of all, as an enterprise adopts OpenStack, the first thing they need to do is do a realistic assessment about their own core competencies. For a lot of organizations, that is not being Linux admins that know how to become a cloud provider themselves and be able to provision an environment and be able to fine-tune it the way they need to. For those that do go down that path, from the interviews I've done, every single one I've talked with said you cannot expect to run a production level workload on an OpenStack deployment within the first 6 months if you go at it by yourself. There's a substantial amount of uptime learning that's required. And part of that is the lack of an updated reference architecture that exists for the core platform.
Agreement.
And the thing is there's no incentive for vendors to update the core reference model. That's something they keep for themselves that differentiates them from other distributions. And so they've kept that proprietary for themselves and haven't contributed this back to the community. So an end user going at by themselves is pretty much swimming in the dark, trying to figure out how to get to the next step or catch up to where the basic conversation is on OpenStack. And so I think that's the biggest first pain point. A lot of organizations, for that reason alone, have leveraged a distribution and then have also leveraged either OpenStack advisory services or OpenStack remote managed services to try and ramp up and accelerate this initial adoption. Then there's the whole next phase of that where organizations get up to a certain level, certain size, and struggle at maintaining that environment above, say, 150, 200 virtual machine environment, where they really do need a full operations team to be able to come in and manage, where they can't just get started with the team that I've described in my report, where they need to go above that. And that's kind of the decision-making point where they have to decide, do we use a service provider to come in and help, or do we try and bring in our operations team? And will our operations team get us so far off track of what we've already built that we're going to be, spending the next year getting them to catch up and see our vision, or do we pay a service provider to see our vision and carry this forward with the OpenStack background? And so those are the two kind of points in the enterprise adoption phase where I see substantial amount of strife in terms of, how do we even achieve this? How do we get going? How do we maintain? Who do we bring in to help us get to that next level?
So that actually bring an interesting question at me that connects two points that I think of. And one of them is that I cannot avoid the kind of conclusion that if I want to run, someone needs to mix it up, by the way. Okay, good. The conclusion that if I really want to adopt OpenStack, it's probably best that I'll use someone that would know how to do that, and I would probably, my best choice would be managed hosted or some sort of a hosted model to actually get that running in the right direction and at least not take the full responsibility myself. And at the same time, if I look at the pitfalls and what Kris mentioned, it does seem that OpenStack is not yet ready for a hosted environment. So how do you go around that?
Yeah, and so that's challenging, and I'm sure that Kris will be able to kind of talk from the service provider standpoint. But from an enterprise standpoint, if they have done a self-assessment where they realize this isn't their core expertise, and that in order to meet their timelines, in order to get moving faster, they're going to use a service provider, the first thing is, first of all, figuring out which model best meets their needs, where do they want it hosted, where do they not want it hosted, and then also kind of getting through some of these pain points. And where can you learn? One of the great things about OpenStack is the community and the community events that are available. I've heard from folks that have been in the OpenStack community for years, are some of the most advanced OpenStack users today. that state that they learn things every single user conference they go to, where essentially they're learning about how other organizations have gotten through some of the scalability issues that Kris had mentioned, where you don't provision 50 virtual machines at once. You set up an automated script to provision smaller workload types so that you can get around some of the challenges that exist in OpenStack's core code today. And that's stuff that you learn from either service provider partners or things that you learn from others within the community that have already gone that path.
And does the fact that VMware, for example, providing value on top of OpenStack and pitch it as we leverage the maturity of VMware with the OpenStack API, does that change any of those pitfalls in your view?
I mean, all VMware VIO does is essentially provide integration into vSphere. So if you're looking for an OpenStack distribution that is the most tightly integrated with vSphere today, then VIO is certainly something that provides that support. Other than that, the distro doesn't claim to do much else. It doesn't claim to get around any core code issues that exist today other than vSphere integration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you don't see that as a solution for the maturity gap for those who still wants to run?
I don't think it's a hypervisor-specific issue. I think it's a code and overall maturity. I think that it's more of, over time, these bugs will be eliminated. Even proprietary tools have bugs. It's just OpenStack's very up and open about where some of their pain points and challenges are today. And it's just been a process at figuring out how to fix them for a number of reasons.
I see. Very interesting, by the way. Kris, why don't you kind of recap on your points? What you had a comment about whether OpenStack needs a reality check.
There are two things from the last round here that I want to comment on. One is that you don't fix that 50 machine start problem by doing it slow or putting a delay loop in something. The proper way to fix that is to actually make a Python script with ambitions into a proper cluster, something that knows what the current state of the cluster is, and then in a kind of state engine transitions to the desired state, and then the system self-regulating and doing things the way and at a speed that the hardware provides. That way, you don't have to time delay loops or things like that. But that kind of architectural discussion and change, that is something that I'm actually missing a lot when I read OpenStack mailing lists or follow the visible discussion everywhere. And that is actually quite frustrating. That if on bad days when I'm depressed and don't think that OpenStack is ever going to succeed in a product that can even survive these simplest workloads that are a bit bigger than a trivial thing that can run on a MacBook, then I have that depression because that kind of talk and discussion is severely lacking from the community. Also, there have been talk about this 200 VM limit. That is probably a rack full of machinery. And that is an interesting inflection point because of two things. One is that you suddenly get traffic between racks, and your default data center is probably not capable of sustaining that in a way that OpenStack requires, because you have oversubscribed your top-of-rack switches. And the other is that this is probably the point where you overload your Nova database, because the way OpenStack talks to a database is, sorry, I was a MySQL consultant, but that is what they're doing is simply brain dead and should be purged from the face of Earth, because that's a shame. Both things, the cross-rack traffic and the database overload that you need to partition the database for Nova, these are two things that are hard to do, and that is probably when you call in external knowledge, or you turn to an external hoster because they have already solved that problem.
So why do you think the discussion in the OpenStack community doesn't go to that level of discussion and cover those things? Do you see a specific reason for that?
If you want that in a very short soundbite, I see a lot of developers and very few operations people, like hardcore data center building, network engineering, operations people. They are severely in need of that in the entire project.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, Lauren, in your view, we're trying to kind of recap here and kind of understand what's the next steps. If I'm an enterprise and I'm considering my options, one is I have different options here on the table here. If I go private and I take the distro, if I take OpenStack, then I need to build a certain team in a certain way to actually be successful with the right skill set and so forth. The other option is use the distro or hosted version, but at the same time, I may face some concerning pitfalls. Guide me. What should I do?
Yeah, so for typically when an organization's about to make the decision on what type to adopt, the first thing that they typically come across is do we want distro or pure code? That's typically the conversation they have before they think about whether they want to bring in expert advice, whether they want to actually host that elsewhere, or whether they want to do remote managed services. Typically, it starts at that level. And although there's a lot of very public examples of folks that use direct code, the list is actually quite small compared to those that are using distros. And even those that have very popular stories that talk about their OpenStack environment and tend to leave out the fact that they're using a distro, many of them are using a distro. In fact, many of them are using managed services that attach to that distro as well. So once they've decided distro, once they've bought onto how they'll consume the code itself, they've then bought some sort of managed services. And again, kind of tying back to the inflection point of the 200 virtual machines, this is something I hear time and time again. And again, it does come to the fact that it largely is development teams within organizations, product teams that are trying to build out these environments themselves. And it's not necessarily operations best practices. And that's the reality of it today. And so whether that means they go with a converged internal with managed services or distro with managed services attached or fully outsource that solution is dependent upon how confident they are in their staff. And it's also partly a cost decision in terms of whether they've made heavy infrastructure investments to go along with that. And we've been talking kind of about this range of very small to 200 virtual machines. There are a number of organizations that have very large OpenStack environments that are using OpenStack to support applications that are substantial, that host 1 million users at once. There are OpenStack environments that reach more closely to 200,000 cores. But I think those are the exceptions in the market today, and some of the more advanced OpenStack users today, whereas more commonly it does sit in that smaller range for majority of users.
Mm-hmm. So you're basically saying that the reasons why I would choose a distro or managed hosted would be obviously combine, first of all, the skill set on how much I can actually develop things myself versus, and including also the cost aspect of that. And would it be fair to say that if I'm a small organization, I should probably be leaning towards managed hosted, or is it not related to size in your view?
For a lot of organizations, the decision has to do, and I think there's a little bit of background noise. I think the decision partly has to do with whether who they want to go, who the additional expertise is going to come from. Do they feel confident in their internal operations team on buying in and fostering this? Or do they think that they're going to lose a lot of the capabilities by bringing in their own operations team on fixing some of these issues without losing access to that? Whereas vendors are incentivized to essentially get you moving faster and meet the demands that business unit is serving. I think it's more of an organizational challenge and folks struggling with how developer enablement is seen within the organization. And so I think a number of hosting providers benefit from substantial OpenStack knowledge and also incentivized to solve real-time problems now for those that were the first to establish OpenStack deployment within their own organization.
I have a quick question slash thought. So it's interesting. It almost seems counterintuitive or oxymoronic, I guess, to describe, OpenStack in a cost-effective kind of sort of perspective when you describe the specialized staff that's required either to run it or the managed services that you need to, to employ in order to, get it up and working. So that's one thought. I want to see how that works, or how to, how that actually makes sense. And also I want to know from your, research, what is the average investment that you've seen is required in order to actually get a strong OpenStack, robust OpenStack ready for the enterprise?
Sure. So first off, I don't think that OpenStack necessarily saves money. I think it's a question of where do you want to spend that money? Do you want to spend that money on investing in a team, investing in building out an internal environment that will support the next generation of applications for your environment? Or do you want to spend that on a public cloud provider? Do you want to spend that on external services to potentially foster those workloads? And will there be limitations due to nuances in the pricing of a public cloud depending on workload type? So are there data out fees? Will it have initial issues, error rates upon provisioning workloads for a high-performance workload? Are there nuances that you're going to face by not being able to customize and build your own cloud that meets your own use case, whether that's compliant or use case driven? So I think that's part of it is that it's not necessarily a cost-saving story for most organizations. It's more of this is an investment we're going to make because we see this inflection point where we are going to have a substantial number of net new applications, and how do we host that or have a deployment option for that moving forward? And then in terms of where folks try and get cost-saving metrics when they do, if you look at some of the cost analysis that's been done by some of the end users in the market, part of it is on avoiding hypervisor licensing costs. So instead of, for their net new environment, investing in a proprietary hypervisor, they will look at a commodity-based hypervisor, so in OpenStack's case, KVM, to host that net new environment, and are hoping that their net new environment will not have that cost incurred upon that new set of resources. Very rarely do I see folks actually going back and converting their existing hypervisor licenses and trying to transition the applications built on those over to their new OpenStack environment yet. There's talk of it, but I really have only seen one use case today. More often than not, it's about avoiding that future cost incurrence moving forward. How do we build a cheaper commodity, almost public cloud, and embrace some of the public cloud core economics in my own internal data center?
Okay. How do you see, traditional hypervisors like ESXi that becoming free and, influencing that kind of, decision making?
I think that for the most part, there's a substantial base of workloads that are already based on ESXi today, along with other hypervisors. And so I think they're less concerned about the existing workloads making that transition as of yet. I think there's fear of it moving in that direction. I think that there's very little evidence that existing will move or has moved yet. I think the bigger thing is will they continue to grow in terms of number of new potential licenses that they can sell, and I think that is something that they're concerned with, and why you'll see a number of interest in essentially trying to make sure that it integrates with existing and trying to eliminate some of the integration pain points, but I have yet to see anything to address the cost aspect of that.
Very interesting. Kris, do you have any thoughts to add to Lauren?
I think OpenStack is most definitely not a cost-saving thing. You better think of it as a way to do high-density computing. When you go back 10 years, which was the last time we had discrete machines with a single core, then you had 50 machines with 50 cores, 50 gig of network interfaces aggregated. And that is now a single machine, 2 head units that takes on all this. So if you put 10 of these into a rack today, that was 20 racks 10 years ago. And that is half a data center that you now put into a single rack. But this kind of high density brings its own challenges, and that is a lot what we see here. Because 10 years ago, you had 50 cores and you had 50 gig of aggregated network capacity. And today, in that single box, you have only 40% of that, 20 gig on the average. Or you are looking at Google-grade fairy dust and Mellanox special cards. And then you are looking at very new, very cutting-edge switches and 100 gig interconnects and stuff like that. That probably is too expensive and too new at the moment to deploy it on a larger scale in the data center. So you have a lot of capacity in a single rack that is under-networked because it has only 40% of the capacity from 10 years ago. And then you need to leave the rack, and the rack is probably also oversubscribed. So when you leave the rack, you have even less capacity. And that means you have a very, very high RPM engine running, trying to compute, that has a hard time reaching the data. And that, if you try to actually solve that problem, you're looking at a lot of money in network infrastructure and storage infrastructure that you have to throw at the problem to make it go away. And only then you get at the hardware level, and it is not even an OpenStack problem, it is basically a high density problem. You're looking at a deployment that is actually balanced and comparable to the data center with 20 racks that you had 10 years ago. That is a very, very hard engineering challenge, and that is also something that you cannot build with current data center networks in most locations. So you are looking basically at the large scale network overhaul if you try to deploy that in your existing data center and your existing network.
That's great insights. So I think we're about to wrap up here for an hour, a very interesting hour discussion, both Laurent and Kris here. If I need to conclude it and kind of wrap it, and I'll let each one of you put his last statement on here. I'll start with you, Kris. What would you say, from your experience, are things that you would do differently today if you would approach OpenStack?
I would pay a lot more attention to the SDN problem. That is the most immature component in OpenStack at all. If you look at Neutron in Icehouse, it's completely laughable. If you look at Neutron now, it's a respectable proof of concept. But for production, you need an SDN product that is actually product, and an infrastructure that is capable of supporting that. That is the main breaking point for larger OpenStack deployments, larger than a single rack. And that is the main breaking point for anything that uses Ceph or does any other kind of hyperconverged storage. That is such a big technological challenge that is a separate problem from OpenStack that is at least as large as OpenStack alone.
Excellent. And Laurent?
The big thing that I would highlight for organizations, and if I would have done things differently, it's difficult when you're not in that position of trying to build momentum and consistency between. And I think as we look at the SDN at Neutron, essentially it bought on very early to a networking concept that had not yet been established. Which is relatively new, where essentially there's still a lot of ambiguity in the market about fully software-defined networking components versus those that are kind of a mix between hardware and software solutions, whether you're looking at a Cisco ACI or more of a Nicira type approach. And because of that, it's difficult for those that are building out workloads in that the right combination of these two solutions meet the OpenStack needs at any given point in its maturity and the size of that particular workload. And so you see a lot of back and forth, a lot of redesign required throughout in order to try and accommodate this. Neutron is certainly the biggest area of concern. And it would have been great starting out had they kind of figured out what that would be like, trying to avoid some of these pain points. But I think that is on the to-do list of a number of folks over the next year. I know that a lot of the telcos, that's the number one thing they're trying to do. They've committed to the next year of trying to improve that particular component, at least. And then after that point in time, looking to see, do they need to start a fresh project to kick off and actually provide a viable solution? Do they need to look at parallel services like Open Daylight? How will they problem solve for that? So I certainly think that that's easy to point out is the core issue to OpenStack today, and likely where the most amount of change is going to happen with OpenStack over the next year or so. I think that the biggest thing that enterprises should think about as they think about OpenStack is that the platform of choice that they want to have their net new resources based on? And if so, are they really willing to make a commitment in that? Does that align with their overall infrastructure sourcing plans over the next few years? Or is that something that they would rather look at alternative platforms for?
It's an excellent concluding remarks on that regard. You would think that, with the level of, the industry where it is right now, that people would approach those type of projects less naively than they do right now, and those questions would be more obvious. But it's interesting that you need to kind of resurface them over and over again to make sure that people do take into account those considerations. And I've seen a lot of projects that haven't gone through those. But I wanted to really thank you, Lauren and Kris, here for sharing a lot of your experiences. Hopefully we help some of our listeners to at least save some of the pitfalls that other people have already gone through, and at least start with a more fresh journey, or at least realistic journey, I should say. And with that, I also wanted to thank Sharon, my co-host, for this talk. Sharon, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was great to join you guys. You can follow our Facebook page, OpenStack and Beyond. You can follow us on SoundCloud, and you can catch the recap on the Cloudify blog at cloudify.org/blog. Thank you, Lauren and Kris. It was a great episode. I appreciate it.